Welcome back to the official Atari Games podcast. This is Jason here, and I am joined by just one special guest here. We got Tim Lapetino, creative director here at Atari and author of The Art of Atari. But we'll get into all that stuff later. How's it going, Tim? Welcome to the pod.
It's going well. Thanks so much for having me.
Awesome. Thank you for being here. It's gonna be like I haven't done one of these one-on-one interviews in a while, and usually it's more of like a get to know you kind of thing. But this one we're gonna keep focused on you, keep it focused on the on who you are, what you're doing at Atari, and we'll just get into it. We'll get deep into it. But we got some stuff to take care of before we get there. First of all, a little bit of housekeeping. Just one game to really focus on here. Yars Rising. We are less than 1 month away from this game dropping. So if you haven't wishlisted, go and wishlist it. If you haven't pre-ordered it on your console of choice, go do that. And if you so choose to get the physical version, which is highly encouraged because, I mean, it's a pretty cool physical package you got there. Great art. That is also available on Switch and PS5. So you can get that on Best Buy, Amazon, etc. Also, not game related, but kind of, event based. If you're listening to this before PAX West, by the time this comes out, it'll be less than a month away as well. I will be there. Tim, you going to be there? You going to be at PAX West?
Not this time, unfortunately.
All right, because the first time we met in person was actually at PAX East earlier this year.
That's right.
Yeah. And that was a lot of fun. So if you want to come by, say hello, play some games, we'll have a lot of games. Atari games, Digital Eclipse games, we got anything from Night Dive in there? I think we might have. There might be a Night Dive thing. Who knows? Come by and find out. That's what I'll say.
Yes, it'll be a surprise.
Be a surprise. There's at least there's going to be a couple surprises in there. I think you might be pleasantly surprised to come by.
Very much so, and that's what I'm going to be working on up to that point. So we'll have some cool things to talk about, I'm sure.
Yeah, you and me both. We got got some stuff going on that. Anyway, we don't need to get into that. Join the Discord, Atari Discord. That link's down at the bottom. Links to Yars Rising, all that stuff down below as well. Got a warm-up question for you, Tim.
All right.
Before we start talking about you. This one was provided by, I don't know how to pronounce this name. I feel like it's kind of a tightrope pronouncing it, but I'm going to say Knuckle Allant. Or Nukel Allant, something like that. Anyway, they write, which movie featuring Atari games or characters is your favorite? Now, this was a question that was proposed a few weeks back, and I pocketed it knowing that you would be here. And I was like, Tim probably has an answer to this question.
I mean, if I go slightly out of the box in answering this question,
I'm going to go way out of the box.
I mean, I feel like the obvious answer for me is Blade Runner, right?
Okay.
There are no games, there are no characters, but there's a gigantic, huge Atari logos, whether you're watching the first Blade Runner or the sequel. And I guess for me, all that says is that like Atari is so amazing that even though the environment has gone to garbage and everything looks terrible in the neo post-apocalyptic future, that Atari will still be there. So we're gonna survive up to that point where Harrison Ford is running around and retiring replicants.
Yeah, you got it.
Yeah, replicants. So like apparently whatever we're doing now works because in the future we'll still be there to bear witness to the crashing of human civilization in science fiction.
Yeah, I think that's a great choice. See, my mind, it immediately, there was only one answer for me. I'm a huge James Bond fan. Okay. So what does that mean? Even the unofficial never say never again counts. And it was actually, that was actually one of the first James Bond movies I ever saw as a kid. And this is the one, if you're not familiar, this is the one that is actually, it's Thunderball. There was a big rights dispute with Thunderball. So what do? They remake Thunderball with Sean Connery out of retirement. So you got an old James Bond, and I'm not talking like campy Roger Moore old James Bond, who is my favorite, by the way.
Oh, I love Roger Moore.
But no, you got Sean Connery way out of his prime. Like I think there's a scene in this movie where he gets like massaged too hard or something. It's really bizarre. But the point is, the villain Max he's got a thing for games, I guess. So there is a whole scene that takes place in an arcade. And the entire arcade is Atari games. You see Gravatar, you see Centipede, you see all of those games. You just need to watch a little bit of it. And then it leads to one of the most ridiculous showdowns between Bond and Villain, where they're playing a one-on-one video game of like taking over the world, where the worse you do, the bigger shock you get. This
Man, it
is,
has been so long since I've seen that.
yeah.
I'm gonna have to revisit that. It has been a while.
Oh, if nothing else, just watch that scene. But that scene,
That's
if you watch
great.
a clip on YouTube, it starts with Kim Basinger at the arcade playing. I don't know what game exactly, but you clearly see Gravatar logos, you see Centipede logos, you see
Nice.
all. It seems to be an arcade entirely Atari focused.
Well, I think we need to do some sort of anniversary thing and bring Kim back. I mean, I'd
Yeah,
happy to have her. Let's get her on the show.
yeah. Kim, what was your favorite Atari game that you played on the set of Never Say Never Again? I'm sure that
Totally,
was
I
a
love it. All right,
prominent moment in your career.
make it happen, Jason.
Oh, I got to make it happen. All right, hey, if you're listening and you got that connection, you
Yes,
know, let's
Kim,
find out.
our DMs are open.
Yeah, at Atari on Twitter/X. All right. Well, thanks for entertaining that question. Anything else you want to throw out there? I don't know if there's, because it says Atari games or characters. That one, my choice says games. I think yours has the brand. I can't think of any that I can think of that have Atari characters. Like, it, Bentley Bear ever waltz
Oh,
on set of some
you
movie?
got Pixels, the Adam Sandler movie with
True.
Centipede is
Hmm.
pretty well established in that film. I mean, Pac-Man kind of steals the show, and rightly so in that movie. But yeah, maybe that if that movie had a little less Adam Sandler in it, we'd be
Oh,
talking about it more. I mean,
maybe a
I
little
mean,
less Cubert, because that was probably the most prolifically unfortunate point of that movie. I think there's a little Cubert babies spoiler alert at the end, implying that, you know what? Let's move
yeah,
on.
yeah. It's
Tim,
better not to ask too many questions about that.
yeah, let's move on to our topic of the show, and that's you, Tim Lapetino.
It's my favorite subject.
Perfect. That means I have to do very little work here, and I could just let you go. Um, who are you? I want to start there. Let's start with a simple question. Who are you? What is it? What does a creative director do?
Well, I do a lot of things. I do whatever needs to be done. But I think if you really want to boil it down, I am sort of in charge of our design and branding at Atari. So that means our design team works on packaging, logos, some of the strategic marketing that we do, and a lot of image making. So whether it's talking about things that are going on, key art for our sort of like the retro plus platform video games like the Atari 2600 plus, or working with the games team. We do help out as well there, but we're really sort of in charge of bringing the brand to life, right? So that means like how is the Atari brand expressed on products, on the web, in licensing? We're really in charge of making sure that that happens, and that happens in a way that's consistent with our brand. It sort of harmonizes with the history, but also makes sense in a powerful way in 2024.
Yeah. And you also wrote the Art of Atari.
I did.
That has to be brought up, because that is huge. I remember, walking in my first day at Atari, and that thing was there, and I'm like, this is really cool. This was like, you Atari has had like a hell of a history, ups and downs. That goes without saying. And then you look at this book, and that's the thing that everybody wants, like more so than any game that was being produced when I joined the company. Like the thing that they're like, look at this, like the shining example of an Atari product was like the Art of Atari. It wasn't necessarily a game, so to speak. And that's not necessarily to criticize anything at the time. I think it speaks to the quality and like the depth and the passion of that book. So what is the story behind that? Like, what is how did that come about? What was it about Atari that drew you to create something like that?
Well, first of all, thanks for saying that. It's very kind. I appreciate it. I think when I started working on that, I mean, that was now almost 10 years ago that I started working on it. I think that's probably right. Might even been before that. Um, but my background, I have sort of a double barrel background as a graphic designer, but also a writer. I came came out and I went to journalism school. I spent a little bit of time as a writer and reporter, and then a graphics guy. And this sounds very old, but think about this. This is before social media. This is before blogs. This is before sort of the democratization of journalism. And I really didn't want to start my career by writing obituaries and covering city council meetings, which was kind of the way to do it. That was sort of the way you did it coming up in the 90s. I'm dating myself a little bit here, but so I have this journalism background, but also this very much design background. And I grew up with Atari. That was my first console. I mean, it was really my first love. Um, absolutely loved the games, but also, as a kid, I was really fascinated by the art. On the front of the packages, like especially in a time when the graphics were much more simple because that's what home consoles look like, right? Even they were more simple than arcade machines and what arcades could do with their sort of discrete chips and really more advanced hardware. And for me, it was really interesting because you'd sit down and you play something like Centipede or Star Raiders or even an Activision game, and the artwork sort of connected the dots for you. Like it sort of like brought you into this world that had characters and emotions and stuff that sort of transcended the actual games, right? So the games themselves were fun. I mean, if those games weren't good, we wouldn't be having this conversation today. But also, like it sort of set the stage for your brain, like, and it was sort of this imagination gap of going from the artwork on the front of there, on the cartridge, on the box, on the manual, to actually playing the game. So when you're sitting in adventure, you're not just thinking of you're a little square, right? You're this rectangle floating through this maze, that you're this you're this adventurer. You're walking through these, were they hedge mazes, were they castles, like, and the art really sort of brought all that stuff to life in a way that sort of completed the picture, right? And so I was totally obsessed with the boxes, and I would stare at them. I mean, they were kind of like comic book covers, right? Or paperback novels or movie posters. And I love those. And I remember distinctly as a kid saying to my dad, I'm like, well, I want to save these boxes. And he's like, what do you save the boxes for? You save the games. He's like, that's like saving the box for your refrigerator, right? He just thought it didn't make any sense. So, of course, out they went. Of course,
Oh,
like young, what was I, like five or six maybe? Um, I never forgot it then. And so when I, grew up and I was an adult in college, I discovered in the 90s that people were still into Atari and they're really interested in this stuff. And there was this sort of wave of like nostalgia for these things. And there were people making new games, homebrews, like some of the very first homebrew Atari 2600 games came out in like 95, 96. So that was like right as I was like really discovering the early internet. In college, everybody, we had these great fast connections. And I started getting into that scene, and it sort of led me to buying some of those boxes. And I went through my early professional career as a writer, but also as a logo designer. So I designed a lot of logos. I worked on corporate identity, and I just thought, it's so interesting. There are these sort of mythical stories about the creator of the Nike swoosh or the Apple logo, the Polaroid logo, all these sort of like famous logos in the pantheon of like Gen X, 60s, 70s, 80s design. The IBM logo is one of them. And I just thought, like, everyone knows the Atari logo, but nobody knows who designed this. So I started looking into it. And at the same time, I sort of was really interested in how did that box art come to be? Who are the people behind that? And I started digging in. I started doing some research, and there was a little bit on the internet, but not a lot. But I wrote about this at one point. I had a blog, because everybody had a blog in the 2000s, in the early 2000s, right?
sure.
And
Yeah.
and
You have a blog spot?
it was I was fancy. I had a WordPress integration with my
Ooh.
website, so I was like I had fancy pants, right? But I created this, and I had read I had seen some of the signatures of some of the art, and I had noted, hey, these are a couple of artists who I really love, and they're inspiring me, and they're a couple of Atari artists. Well, like 2 years later, somebody commented on my blog and said, hey, you know what? I grew up next door to one of the Atari artists, and I know him. Would you like to like talk to him? And I was like, well, heck yeah. And so that was Cliff Spawn, who illustrated 19 of the first Atari 2600 cartridges, right? The very beginning. And so Cliff and I got on the phone, and it was like an hour and a half long. And I remember, because I just thought we'd have a casual conversation. I was like, oh, what was it like? What do you remember? And I realized at the end of this, I had like 3 or 4 pages like on this yellow legal pad. I'm furiously scribbling all these really interesting things that he's saying. And I remember hanging up that phone, and I was like, wow, if any other artists have the kind of recall about specific games and art that Cliff did, maybe I could write a book about this. And that was the first, thing. And then the second thing was I came into a whole bunch of original Atari artwork in the form of slides and transparencies, which was kind of the way you'd archive art back in there. You'd photograph it on these nice, really high resolution slides and transparencies, and that's
Yeah.
what you use to make boxes or advertising or things like that. And I was able to find a bunch of this stuff. So all of a sudden, I'd interviewed a couple artists, and I had gotten some original art, and like I had the sort of the makings of a book. And that kept on for a while until I got connected with some folks who got connected to the publisher, and we signed a book deal. And then it was like sprint, sprint, sprint to the end, because when I came on board the project, they already had a date in mind. So in 2016, like I think it was October 2016, two good things happened that week. One not great thing, but the two great things is this book came out and the Cubs won the World Series. I'm from Chicago, so that was like a lifelong, literally a lifelong dream. So those two things happened in the same week, and that just led me here, right? I dug much more into pop culture and video games. I sort of went from being more of a corporate designer at design studios to really focusing on my passions, which are like entertainment, pop culture, all the geeky things.
You can't just bury the lead on say, oh, I happen to get some of these transparencies and things. It's like you're talking about like where were you physically at the time, and then how did you actually acquire these, like, let's call them artifacts and make them sound very like
Yes.
Indiana Jones style.
I mean, it was kind of like it was kind of that way. I mean, I had been in this sort of, in the collector community for a while. AtariAge.com was the place, and it still is really, for people who were interested in the stuff. And there was a few people who were interested in the art, and somebody there had bought a bunch of slides and negatives from somebody who bought them from some who got them from Atari, as the original Atari was sort of closing up shop. They were kind of getting rid of things. They were getting rid of these offices, so things were getting thrown away. I mean, there's crazy stories of the original Atari. People just they're like, okay, we got to sell everything. It's not nailed down, and they were selling these. Like big filing cabinets for $1 a piece just to get them out of there. And so people would come who were starting an office. And I remember one specific man came there. Because he was starting a company and he needed these things, and he found, and they were, he drives up with a truck. He's like, oh, I'll buy these cabinets. And they're like, okay, we'll just throw all the stuff that's in them out. And he starts looking through what's in there. And there's like production artwork, and there's all this like really rare stuff. And he's like, well, no, just leave it in there. I'll take that too. And he ended up holding on to this stuff for decades. And so like things like that went missing. That stuff eventually made its way to the Strong Museum of Play in Rochester, New York, which they have an
Oh yeah.
incredible collection. But so these things sort of passed hands, and then at one point, I believe it was like Easter morning, one morning, and this guy messaged me. He's like, "Hey, I know we didn't talk like for like a year, but I'm actually going to sell all this stuff. I'm going to sell these things that I have. Are you interested?" And so had this. I'm like getting dressed, and like going to go to church with my daughter, who was a baby at the time, and my wife at the time, and so I eventually bought this stuff from him, and that became the nugget that I sort of built around, and I started to meet collectors who had original art. I met, some of the original artists, one of the original Atari photographers who was in charge of photographing a lot of the art, and he still had all these things. So like this sort of, it's like a snowball rolling down the hill, because Atari at the time, we're talking a couple versions of Atari, ago,
Yeah.
didn't have those archives, because I mean the company changed hands, and these things just sort of disappear. They go missing. They get thrown out. I mean, and this is not a story that is unique to Atari. Like this has happened in plenty of other companies, and
Yeah.
you find, you talk about Hasbro, Mattel. I mean, just things like that. Just don't, people weren't thinking about it the way we think about it now in
Oh,
terms of
you
like
could.
the value of these.
One of the examples I could think of is actually, I believe it's Ninja Gaiden 2 on the Xbox. I think it was on the original Xbox, maybe 360. But basically, I don't think the original source code for that exists, or they don't have it anymore, which is why the only version of that exists is like the Sigma version that they recreated or something. So yeah, different practices, different procedures. Totally, you're absolutely right. It's not just an Atari thing; it is an industry thing. And I think now, especially with the rise of, like, I mean, the digital present, I'll say, is, and everything being cloud backup. And it's just a lot easier to keep track of everything and iterations and versions and those kind of things, to go back and save things for prosperity, I guess. So
Yeah, absolutely. And
makes
I
things
think
easier.
you have to be pretty forward looking to think about that. I mean, this stuff was made to be disposable. I mean, I have a friend who
Yeah.
he's sort of my counterpart in the GI Joe world. Like, he's collected a lot of things, and he talked about how, if you were, I was really into GI Joe when I was a kid. So you've got like this painting of Duke, right? And this is amazing painting that goes on the front of the box. Well, when they went to like make a new version of the character that was had a different paint scheme, they literally just painted right over the top of the old painting because it saved them time. And you're just like, what? Like, this is stuff that's like now very valuable, but it wasn't thought of that way, right? No one,
Yeah,
not many people were thinking about it that way. So that has changed. But I mean, different companies do things different way. I mean, some of it is about the chain of custody, and it's like, does that company continue? I did a work with a team, a book about Street Fighter, and like the Street Fighter games, and
oh nice.
Capcom, they were actually, it was pretty amazing. I mean, they'd be like, "Hey, here's the archives," and our writer who was working on that project, got to go to the archives, but the archives were basically like a glorified storage closet. But I mean, that was still like way better than some of these other places that you saw. So it's really interesting to see how that happens. So there's definitely like a whole lot of Indiana Jonesing here, and kudos to the artists, the collectors. I mean, I met with some art collectors in some really sketchy places, um, to dig into this stuff. So that was a multi-year process to sort of bring all this stuff back into one form, because like I didn't want it to be lost to history, but also this was the book that I wanted to see out in the world, and that was kind of where it led.
Totally. Was there anything along the way that didn't make the cut either? Or basically something you wanted to include that didn't make it, or you couldn't procure the art, or maybe there was a person you wanted to talk to but couldn't reach, and maybe there's more of a darker reason. Maybe it's just someone who just is not alive anymore that just couldn't make it. Because we're talking about really old content here,
Yeah.
just being
No,
realistic about it.
no, absolutely. I mean, I tried to talk to as many people as I could, and I mean, I think when I started out, I knew that, I one of the people that was key is, this is funny considering where I'm sitting here at this moment. Like, I'm the creative director at Atari. Well, the person who was kind of the linchpin for me was George Opperman, who was the original creative director at Atari, and he was an illustrator, designer, but also, he really did all this creative work and sort of led the creative team and built it when Atari was really just getting started. And I would have loved to talk to him, because he was one of these sort of triple threats. Like, I'm not an illustrator for sure, like, but I mean, he could do it all, and he really set the bar for the way Atari did things in the 70s and 80s. And he passed away in, I believe, 1985. I mean, he worked for Atari for quite a while, but I mean, I knew that going in, but just even understanding the circumstances of his time at Atari, I remember stumbling upon somebody. I mean, you really have to give a hat tip to the Atari fan community, who really preserved a lot of things that wouldn't have otherwise. Like, Atari at the time had like an internal email system. I mean, I put email in quotes. It was like an electronic message system,
Yeah.
and there was a message that went out to the whole team. It wasn't really email because it's 1985, and saying, "Hey, this was the official announcement to the team that George Opperman had passed away." And and it was like a nice little coda and remembrance of him, and just people had a lot of good things to say about the work that he did and the influence that he had on Atari. And I wish I could have talked to him, right? I mean, obviously we were talking almost 20 20ish 30 years later, but he left a big impact. So it was fun for me to make sure that I could talk to Nolan Bushnell and talk to some of the other folks, especially the people who were not programmers, who were involved in art and design and
Hmm.
production and photography, and the people who really, like, the company can't run without them. But they're not the people that you're talking about, Todd Fry, who created Pac-Man, who programmed Pac-Man, or Howard Scott Warshaw, who did Yars Revenge. Like those people,
I've
they're
heard of
kind
them.
of the usual suspects. Like, and I've talked to them as well. I think they're great people and they have great insights. But I
Yep.
really wanted to talk to the sort of behind the scenes folks a little bit in the art and design world.
Right. What was man? I got to think that what was things like concept art for these old games back in the day. What did those look like? Like, to be honest, now you think of concept art and you're like, well, you can actually create the things that are in your imagination, right? Whereas back in the day, it's like, well, we're gonna have these blocks here, and then that's the game. This is gonna look kind of like a person, and that's gonna look kind of like a block because it's a block.
I mean, there really wasn't concept art, at least in terms of game. Like, there was
Right.
game graphics, right? But the idea was you'd start with an idea, or maybe you'd start with a mechanic, and you'd build a game around a mechanic, or you found some interesting thing to do, right? And then you built the game around it. But since these were one person, for the most part, one
Yep.
person doing the games, like it was all in their head. But there was a lot of collaboration. There was like, hey, maybe I have something, right? And then they would put it on play, in the office, and people would play it, and you'd get some feedback. Was this good? Was it not good? Was it fun? Did people keep coming back to it? I mean, it was such the Wild West, And then when you're talking about like game, key art, like this key art that we talk about, it was very
Yeah.
much, here's the name of the game. Sometimes they got to play the game, often they didn't. And you're saying this is a tennis game, this is a this game, and it was up to the artists who really like brought it to say, hey, you know what, I want you to communicate the energy, the emotion, just the excitement of this or that, right? So if it was a outlaw, you've got like, sort of borrowing heavily from, movie posters of westerns. IP was a little bit more Wild Westy back in the 70s and 80s. But
Oh, you
they
think? Yeah, a
oh,
little bit.
100%. I mean, if you look at something like, I
Yeah,
believe,
yeah,
I think Outlaw looks a lot like, I think it's the Outlaw of Josie Wales. Uh, like you can see some reference to the poster art. You can also, now that we have the internet, people look at baseball art and you'd be like, oh, that's pretty sure that's Mike Schmidt, or this other play, like recognizable baseball players, because they were just pulling from whatever reference they could, right? But the idea was that they didn't necessarily need to depict gameplay. It was really about communicating the ideas behind it, because TV games were still really new, and the idea was
right.
like, give people something recognizable, something familiar, and something that captures the fun of playing the game, versus like, let's make sure that the square we show and the other square look exactly like they look on the screen. This like sort of
Yeah,
reality side, like that wasn't a thing.
right.
That wasn't a goal.
Totally. Yeah. I have while we're sticking to the past a little bit, I did solicit the audience for some questions. Um, got a lot that were completely irrelevant, but you know what? Hey, you tried. I appreciate the participation. But I want to ask this question. This is a good time for this. 7 to 7 asks, what is Tim Lapetino's top 10? He says 10, but you could give me however many you want.
10.
Cover artwork for 2,600 games, but you don't have to list 10. Whatever you want to list, like three or whatever comes to mind. Just start rattling them off. You're like, man, these 2,600 games are
Yeah,
top.
yeah. I mean, I think the first one is Missile Command. That George Opperman painted
Oh
that one, and that
yeah,
was originally used. It was first used on the arcade flyer, but I mean, it's just amazing. It has this real '70s sort of, Buck Rogers style. He's got this helmet. But you've got
yeah.
this really great composition where, it's very much this montage of missiles and gigantic, mainframe keyboards and typing and all this stuff, and it tells this multi-stage story of these different places. You've got missiles coming down to the earth, you've got them launching, you've got, you're at missile command, as it were, and these people involved, and it looks like there's a whole scene there and there's a whole storyline, but that's just due to the artist, right? So that's a top 5 for sure. I think Star Raiders is a really great one, because it's, this cockpit view and you've got this hand on the console. It just has this really, really great look to it, really nice painting. um, I would say, so these are trending a little sci-fi, but Surround also. It's not a super super well known Atari game, but it basically is sort of like a a worm game where you have to follow each other and block each other in with these trails. I mean, think of almost like the light cycles of Tron. Like it plays a little bit like that, but the image for that has this really 70s style, bringing it to physicality life that Cliff Spawn did, which I think that one just it screams 70s, but also it's like really imaginative interpretation of the game, which I think is interesting. Another one is like the Atari 2600 Pac-Man. Like that game gets some grief for a number of reasons, and
Yeah.
some of which I think is not. I don't think it's totally fair, but like this just this talks about like the Wild West of IP of the time. So if you're to make a Pac-Man licensed game today, you would use the official Pac-Man art. You would use the official look and the colors. That was not the case in the 80s. Atari licensed Pac-Man, and Namco at the time, now Bandai Namco, said, "All right, do what you need." Do what you want, just make sure the checks come. And Atari made their own Pac-Man, and so the artist Hiro Kimura designed this Pac-Man who's totally spherical, who's like very light colored yellow. He's airbrushed. He's really fun. He's got
Yeah.
these wacky gloves, and like looks like he's got is it Adidas on there? Like just a really really unique version of Pac-Man that really has never been seen before or after Atari, and Atari had their own Pac-Man, which I think is so cool, and also it's just really rendered well. Like, and I'll say all this as a designer, as an artist, it's not just the ideas or the good games that attach to it. Like these are done at a really high level. Like they're
Yeah.
very well designed.
This is I'm getting a lot of vibes of Miss Minutes from Loki,
Oh,
right?
100%. Yeah, absolutely. Right.
Yeah.
It feels very
Yeah.
mascotty, of that
Totally.
era.
And they try to capture that time and place, but this is like a really good version of saying like, oh, you want to know some Miss Minutes inspiration art? Like, check this out. Like, this is I've actually never seen this. I never even looked at this Pac-Man art before. That's
Yeah.
some wild
No, it's really
stuff.
good, and I think it's interesting because I think in the hubbub of people saying, "Oh, it wasn't like the arcade game, it
No,
wasn't as fun," I mean, the reality is I think we are at a place in games where the idea that a port of a arcade game or a other game had to be exactly like it, I don't think that was set in concrete. Like, I don't think that
no.
idea was confirmed,
Well,
right?
that
And
and
so,
that actually never even became a reality until Dreamcast, right? I
yeah,
think Dreamcast, N64, maybe when you were able to get like the exact same San Francisco Rush on N64 and PlayStation, or when Dreamcast came out and you had the same Crazy Taxi that was in the arcades on Dreamcast, and then more stuff.
right, right,
So
and of that
yeah,
era, whether you're talking about 2600 or the Atari 5200 or even 7800, like you could approach it. You're approaching arcade fidelity, but it was, for various reasons, it wasn't going to be that way. Like the arcade machine has a more vertical screen. A TV was 4:3, that's more horizontal. So there's already compromises that the Atari
yeah,
team had to make. But I've written about this and reported on it at some length. Like I've talked to Todd Fry a couple times. One for another book I did that was all about Pac-Man.
okay,
It's called Pac-Man: Birth of an Icon, and we talked a lot about. He's had a lot of decades to reflect on that game, so it's very interesting to talk to him about it. But it's all like in the spirit of making a great version of Pac-Man. That was its own thing. That was the idea behind it. So I give that game. I think that's a legit, pretty cool game. I mean, as a kid, I just loved playing it. And you're like, oh, I have Pac-Man at home. Like that was
yeah.
that was the novelty, right? It was like Pac-Man at home. What? Like, and
But
I
that
think,
was but that was also kind of what led, because a lot of times you talk about the video game crash, right? And ET gets most of the takes most of the blame. But this version of Pac-Man is actually one of the is like contributing to the reasons for the crash, right? Because people would buy that expecting it and they're like, oh, this isn't very good. And then it just kind of allow them to get disillusioned. Like it was another one of those things. And maybe ET was the straw that broke the camel's back, but this is definitely a straw.
yeah, I mean, it definitely like it was not what people didn't know what they want, but maybe they decided they didn't exactly want this. But that being
Yeah,
said, like Pac-Man still sold like 7 million copies. Like
sure.
I mean, I think it was the best-selling Atari 2600 game of all time. I mean,
Makes
7
sense.
million copies. That's insane amount of copies. Like that, I think the install base at that point was like nearing 10 million 2600s. So like you're thinking about 2/3 of the people, 3/4 of the people, that own the system will buy that. I mean, that's a huge deal. So I do think maybe some of the sheen came off the Apple, but I do think part of it was also this is something that Nintendo rectified, right? Is when the NES came out, Nintendo locked that thing down, right?
That's right.
The
That's
only
right.
way that you could
Yep.
make a game for them is you had to go through their process, you had to go through their manufacturing.
It's seal
Whereas,
of quality. Yeah, the Nintendo seal of quality, which
right, and
later just became the Nintendo seal.
right, and Atari, I mean, these are early days, right? Like
Yeah.
Atari wasn't thinking about that. They did not think about there was going to be companies that were looking for a quick buck because video games were hot. I mean, there were X-rated video games released. I mean, by these kind of shady people. There was games of really dubious quality, and suddenly you're not selling these online, you're selling them all at retail. So retailers, how do they know the difference between a good game or a bad game? And so now they're starting to push back, and it affects everybody, right? And so it was a crash. Like, I think those are pieces of the wall falling, but I don't think Pac-Man or ET are the cause. I mean, they
Right.
definitely,
It's
you know,
all of it. It's like one of it, but that's the thing is like, you kind of you say 7 million people bought this game expecting one thing. If if any one of those people then gets the next game and that happens to be ET, then you're like, "Ooh, mm,
yeah. Well, I
maybe,
mean,
maybe this ain't it." But, like I said, it's this I do remember this being part of the history. This ET game is definitely part of the story that a
yeah,
lot of people tend to overlook, and it's probably because it is Pac-Man. And they say, "Well, Pac-Man
for
equals good."
sure. For sure, for sure. I think they either overlook it or they totally overinflate the importance. I mean, there's some people like, oh, this was the company killer, or everyone hated those games. I mean, the reality is it's not true. I can
Yeah.
remember my circle of friends being like, these are amazing. Like, we're happy just to have Pac-Man at home. Like, it
Yeah.
was not. But the internet, what does it do? It sort of inflates these things and makes them
Mhm.
seem like they're more real than they are. I mean, we can, ET burying things in the desert. I mean, all that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
Um,
Exactly. It's more fun. It's more fun to bag on ET. Let's just call it what it
hundred
is, right? Yeah.
percent.
With all due respect. Also, Howard Scholar Show, that's all due respect. So, also, I should say, so Bevork asked, what is the most unrepresentative cover art in Atari history? The art that deviates most from the game itself. I think
Hmm.
that's another good one to think about in this context.
Oh, that's a tough one.
Because don't they all, in a way? I mean, they all kind of
Yeah,
try to capture thematically what it is. If I'm going to throw my hat in the ring, it's
yeah,
probably Breakout with the art with the guys in space,
yeah, yeah. Absolutely.
because that
That's a super
is,
super breakout, right?
yeah. What does this have to do with that? It's like the moon. It's
Well,
crazy.
I love that though. I actually that's one of my favorites. I remember thinking as a kid,
Oh,
like, okay,
just to be clear, I'm
yeah,
not
yeah,
knocking the art. I'm not
yeah.
knocking the game. I'm just saying the disparity between them.
Well,
But Breakout's one of those things where if you're trying to create the art that's putting you in a scenario that's you're simulating on screen, what is it? You
yeah.
know?
Right. Well, and so don't forget, like Super Breakout's a sequel, right? So they
Yeah.
already had a sort of Breakout's kind of like a Pong game, like so, and Pong is kind
Yep.
of is basically a tennis game. So the first Breakout, the art is very much about tennis. Well, they're like, well, we can't just do that. We gotta up level this, right? It's Super Breakout. So this idea that this rainbow, sort of wall is now a physical thing in space, like kind of as a kid just the idea that it was reflected in this guy's helmet just
Okay.
absolutely blew my little mind, right? Like, but you're right. Like, I mean,
I love that though. I love that because that gives me a different perspective on it. That my more narrow mind, I'm like, huh, that's odd. That's really
what? No,
weird.
it is totally odd. But I mean, there's nothing that says it's not space, right? And I think
Right.
this is something that I think this ties back to what we're doing right now. We'll have some things that we'll be talking about in the coming weeks and months about new releases and things like that. But I keep coming back to when we're working on the stuff as a team. that it is about those little bits of story, like those things really. I mean, and we're not talking modern games. Modern games, like the story is pretty evident, right? I mean, you're building it into the games.
Yeah.
But when we're talking about some of this older stuff, like those bits of story can have a real outsized impact on how you even think about the games, right? And I think that's super important because they are simple. Like at the end of the day, like this Atari ethos of uh easy to play, easy to learn, difficult to master, right? This idea that like it is just a fun game, you can just sit down and pretty for the most part just play it. Like that, like sort of original Atari ethos still kind of runs through a lot of our games. And I think if it's not fun, doesn't game over, right? Doesn't matter. But if it's fun and then also you just have this little nugget, this little hook, then I think like that makes a game that is fun but also memorable, right? Because there is a little bit of a story, and we're not trying to
Yeah.
create a novella. This isn't Lord of the Rings, tacked on to an original console release or anything like that. Um, but I think it's really important, and like that attempt at storytelling I think is pretty significant. Uh,
Yeah.
so it's
Look,
important.
context, right?
Yes,
Context is
yes.
is a driver. Like it's more motivation. And you have games that are entirely dependent on motivation. Like there are game like visual novels. The whole thing is dependent on what's the scenario because the gameplay is literally selecting things from a list. So it all depends on context. That can absolutely elevate or bring down an experience. That doesn't necessarily mean it can't be overcome by great gameplay, but great gameplay can absolutely be elevated by it. Now, that said, I did completely derail us by answering
Uh,
the question to you. So, what is your personal choice of biggest discrepancy?
I mean, I think I got to go with something like like I think slot racers, which
Oh
seems
boy.
so exciting and so futuristic, and that game really just has nothing. It doesn't feel that way. Like the cars don't feel that way. The look doesn't feel that way. And again, it's the 2600, but like that art is amazing. Like whatever that is, I want to
Yeah.
see the movie version of that. And
Yeah.
and the game does not really even come close to it.
I'm gonna need a timeline from slot racers to Tron or vice versa because
Right?
who is this man? You
It looks
gotta
amazing.
if you're listening, go look up this box art right now. There is a man in the background. I guess he's a driver.
I think so. I mean, Jason, I think that's the next game. It's like Slot Racers 3000, right? It's like give that poor guy a backstory. Like, what's he doing? I wanna hear about it.
And the
Um,
game is like, it's kind of like looks like Dodge 'em a little bit.
it,
It's
it's
like
a
Dodge 'em
it's a
meets
lot like
Pac-Man or something.
Dodgem,
All
right?
right, fair enough.
Yeah. So
That's
I
a
mean, like
great
again,
choice.
fun game, but I think it's fun, and I think if you look at like another good one, flag capture, which is a super obscure one, and I think it's kind of like capture the flag. But the art
Makes
itself
sense.
is like it's like
Whoa.
pirates on the high seas. I mean, it's like, wow. I mean, I super kudos for like just like turning some story into it's like, oh, the flag on our ship or something. Like, I mean, that's a pretty epic looking like Pirates of the Caribbean style thing. Like, that's fun, but like those two things are pretty far apart. But again, like maybe those are the games that most need a little bit of story, to contextualize it and get you to
Yeah.
remember it. So I just think it's very smart.
This is awesome. Oh my god, I love this. This is great. By the way, you gotta if you're following along here, if you're listening and you're not driving and you could access your phone or computer, by all means, you gotta look up these box arts that Tim is throwing out here because these are awesome. These are so cool. Cool, man. All right. Well, I want to kind of shift a little bit to the present. And you know, what is it now they've been working here for I mean, it's less than a year, right? I
Like
think you
six
you got
months, yeah.
yeah, about 6 months. Wow, there you go. Look at you. Like a fresh babe. Um what is what surprised you about the current Atari? Like you had all this knowledge going into the past. I think it's interesting your journalist background. I did not realize that was a big part of it, but that makes a lot of sense as to why Art of Atari goes so in depth. Um, but with that knowledge coming in to the current form of Atari under Wade, um, what were your expectations? What was most surprising? Was there anything that like met your expectations? Like be like where's your head at 6 months in, and versus where it was maybe 6 months ago versus where it was 6 months before that?
That's a great question. I think. Well,
Yeah, I got to get at least one good one on an
no, this is
episode.
good. This is a good meaty one for sure. No, it's a great question. I think it's an amazing team. Like, so that wasn't actually a surprise. Like, I had known a handful of people. I knew of Wade. I'd worked a little bit with some other folks in sort of a smaller like freelance capacity, both at Digital Eclipse and also at Atari. So I felt like I had a pretty good idea coming in. But I think the thing that I did not realize until really spending some time with Wade and Ethan Zubak, our president, how much, not how serious, because everybody's serious. I mean, like we're running a company here.
You've seen this show. You work with me. You know how serious I am.
Yeah, well, just the idea
Very
that,
serious.
like everyone here, like there's not a sense. I think. Well, I'll just say this. I won't speak to previous iterations of Atari, but I will say, like, I think I was very happy and excited about how seriously people would take the legacy of Atari, but also not feeling like we have to be the history is not cement overshoes, right? It doesn't like have to hold us down. Like we want to be super respectful of the history and the brand and realize that how important that is, how much the history means, but also like the fans that have been around for decades and then the ones that haven't, that's a real responsibility. And I think everyone here takes that seriously. Now that can become a shackle, right? That can very much like we can be paralyzed by the history. I also don't get that sense, and I think that balance, I think we're still figuring that out as we go. But I do think there's an effort and a desire for some real balance. Um, so I love that. Like, and I'm really excited about that because I also feel like, I'm a Gen Xer, right? So I sit right in the crosshairs of sort of like, our audience. But if our audience is just Gen X, and you can speak to this, of course, Jason, like this is not a company that has a future, right? Like, Gen Xers are not getting any younger and we're not making any more of us, right? So like there's only less, right? But that's not the plan. The idea is that Atari is a multifaceted brand that really appeals to different generations. It's not just people on the internet sometimes say, "Oh, it's Atari. It's the shambling. Someone's wearing the shambling corpse of Atari." You know,
Yeah.
and and if those people were to spend half a day inside with us, at the offices or when people are there, would I think would be pretty surprised and be like, yeah, this isn't a bunch of people trying to cash in on this IP and just make some money, quick buck. That's not the case. This is people who are passionate about the history, who understand what the brand is about, and also are thoughtfully trying to really think hard about how do we grow it forward and still be true to like at the heart of the brand. And I think this is a brand. I don't think it's a nostalgia wave. Like I don't think we're trying to cash in on nostalgia. I don't think we're trying to ride a wave while we can. I think there is a I mean, I'm not on the business side right here, but I do believe there is a business model, and I believe our company believes that like, hey, there's a way for Atari to move forward in the future and continue to be relevant, continue to be a voice inside of the games industry and outside of it that is powerful and it's impactful. And we have a place in pop culture that is not easily duplicated.
Right. Yeah, exactly. I think that's really well said. I think that yeah, you see all the criticism, right? I mean, I'm a millennial, right? These are things that Atari was at its prime before I was born, and that's just the reality of it. Like the brand has existed as more of a you use pop culture, and that's the perfect way to explain it. It's lived on as a pop culture brand, but it still needs to put in extra work to continue to establish itself as a gaming brand. And I think that's where like a lot of the different ideas come together and exist. And we have a great team of varying ideas that do it while all having the respect of the legacy. Like a good example, right, is like John on your team who's been on the podcast before talking about Neo Sprint. He him and I we'll talk about games and we'll reference like almost the exact same feedback or reference a mechanic of where something is happening, and his reference is 30 years old and mine is like 6 years old.
Yep.
That's the difference. And he's still playing games today, but when he's saying, "Oh, this is just like what is it? Like Ki oh, I'm gonna say something that I hope is not offensive, but it's Kiki Kai Kai or whatever the hell that game is that he like brings up a lot. I definitely butchered it. That's not what it is. I got the last two syllables right, but he'll say that. I'd be like, oh, you mean like a twin stick shooter, like something like that. And that's not to shit talk John, but it's just more like just to say, hey, those that allows you to be checked, and get that wide swath of ideas that have the that have more intimate familiarity with things of that era
Yeah. Well,
versus someone like myself who started on NES.
totally, and I think the concepts and the ideas behind what Atari has done is trying to do it speaks to millennials, speaks to Gen Xers, it speaks to my kids. I mean, they're not just
Yeah.
playing Atari. Well, I mean, they are playing Atari because I work at Atari, but
Yeah.
also it's just fun to see my 9-year-old who's grown up on the Switch. He's grown up on iPad games. He plays Among Us and Roblox. Like, I mean, all these games, like, and these are sophisticated, really interesting, good games, and they're like some of the biggest games. Minecraft. I mean, the biggest games of many generations, right? But he comes back to that, and then he'll sit down and play Mr. Run and Jump, and he's like, "Dad, this
Oh
game."
yeah.
I mean, at first he was super mad. He was like, "This game's super not fair." But then I'm like, "Yeah, this is how we used to do it back in the day. This game's hard." Right, and he
Yeah.
loves it, and you're like, okay, well, if this can legitimately, he's not liking it because Dad likes it. There's plenty of things I like. He's like, yeah, I don't care, like, and he's like, this game's amazing, and you to see the little like light go off, over his head, and being like, it's a totally different kind of gaming, or like this is a different way of thinking about gaming. Like, he was like, this is legit, and he's 9, he's no dummy, like, he's real
Yeah.
smart, and but he like graphics and things like that doesn't bother him because it's super fun,
Yeah.
right? And we're looking at like Neo Sprint, like, he's a really good test case because I'm gonna get an honest opinion, but like the idea that there are principles and there are ideas that transcend the latest technology. I mean,
Yeah.
nobody's saying we're not trying to be Nintendo, right? Like, that's, and no one has ever said that to my knowledge, and like that's not really the goal.
Yeah.
But I think Atari occupies a really interesting space in the sense, like you said, that we are a video game company, but we also occupy a really like an outsized part of pop culture in a way that I don't know that many other video games companies would, right?
Well,
We
here's a good example, right, of something that is uniquely us, right? And I guess some of these companies with fighting games can probably do the same thing. But I was at California Extreme, the expo, which is like a big arcade and pinball expo in California. That was
Yep.
there like a week or two ago, and I was there supporting Alan One. We did a podcast with them as well. Watch the YouTube video so you could actually see the unit. They're making recharged cabinets, and they had for the first time for the public to play the Asteroids recharged arcade cabinet. And to your point about spanning generations, everybody loved it. Like
Yeah.
everybody. I'm talking guys who they ran a tournament, skill based competition, and the winner was a guy who just walked up and played it in like the last hour of the competition and he just whooped everybody, people who were playing for like probably hours. And this guy, because we ran the tournament over two full days, this guy just whooped everybody just because he knew how to use that hyperspace button. He knew where the buttons were. He's like, these are exactly where they should be. This is awesome. This is so good. And it's just like, no matter how old people were, no matter what their familiarity with the game was, everybody was having a great time. Everybody wanted to play some more. And they were playing together, and it really like brought me, and it was a beautiful thing to see.
Yeah.
Not
No,
many people outside, like I said, fighting games maybe, but other than that, that reverence is not really there, at least in the modern sense of what they're doing.
well, and I think it's interesting because you're seeing this. I mean, we'll talk about arcades for a minute. I mean, which is a space that, like with Alan One, we're just getting back into in this
Yeah.
way. But like arcades are sort of, I feel like, have figured this out a little bit. You look at things like Oh, now of course the name is gonna. It's the really big arcade cabinet where a bunch of people play. You can play 5 people. Killer Queen.
Oh yeah, yeah,
Because
yeah.
Killer Queen, like that was the hot thing just a handful of years ago, and it's still popular. Like people have teams, like they're playing esports tournaments, and like it's a fun game,
Yeah, it's amazing.
but it's also a fun game to play with a bunch of people, often with a beverage in your hand, right? I mean, you kind of need your hands, but like, you know what I mean? Like it's that social and like that communal aspect of getting together in a place. You can do it online as well, but that like idea of like people would go to arcade. I have a good friend who owns Logan Arcade in Chicago, so give a shout out to Zespi. It's one of the best barcades around. They've got that cabinet there, or a couple of them, and that's a regular thing. People just come there and they play. They do tourneys, and like they just fill the crowd with people who are playing that game, and it's about the experience and the game, and it's like those two things are together. And I think I love I love the resurgence of arcade machines. I love the rise of barcades and these other things, and I don't think they're gone, right? People crave that
No.
experience. It's not the same as yelling at someone over your mic, when you're playing, Call of Duty, whatever the latest Call of Duty game is. I mean, it's a little different where you're like elbow to elbow and you do that stuff and it's fun.
Yeah. And my background may look a little different to people who watch the video show. And because that's actually, I am down here in Ocean City, New Jersey. And the art boardwalks, arcades, they go hand in hand. Those are always packed. I think the idea of it has evolved, but I think the other thing that it needs to do is create a new experience for people. And sometimes in this nowadays, when everything's online and everybody's kind of solitary, I think that that coming together in the community aspect of an arcade is very nice,
Yeah,
and something different
absolutely.
in and of itself. All right, I don't want to hold you for too much time, but I wrote two questions here now, and they're a little bit heady, a little bit deeper. But
All right.
if you're up for it, we
Sure.
could do one, and then maybe we'll do the other. All right, let's do this one because it's games related. It's kind of what we're talking about. We've been talking about the ambiguity of the concept art of games back in the day versus what was actually visible when you played the game itself. So now things are a lot more literal, right? You're presenting in concept art what you're literally interacting with. How do you think that changes the way people interact with games?
I think I think it flattens the experience in a way where you're like, okay, I just want to see what's inside. Like, or, but I can watch a trailer. I can watch some streamer playing the game. Like, and so like, when you offer me an art, or some design presentation of the game that's basically the game, like that's not that's a to me that's a missed opportunity, because I mean, like if we're really like, well, if we don't put it on the front of the game, no one will know what the game's about. I mean, come on. I mean, like it's 2024. If you want to know what a game's about, you're a couple keystrokes away, right? Like it's very easy, and and that's probably your first connection to it. But I think key art, and this art is really about conjuring more than that. We've I've gotten a chance to work with some of the team on like Volgar 2, which just came out. Um, from one of our other studios. We can give them a shout out, right?
Digital Eclipse, that's right. And go check out that podcast, and you could watch me be terrible at that game.
Which is legitimate because it's really hard.
Oh, it's so fun though. It's so
Yes.
good. I love that kind of challenge in games.
Yeah, but I mean, like working with the team there, like it was very much like no, that game is a great like sort of 16-bit kind of aesthetic, like and the goal on creating the art was not to reproduce that aesthetic, because if you want to see the gameplay, go see the gameplay. But if you want the idea and the ideas that we were conjuring, it was Frank Frazetta and like swords and sorcery, like that sort of 70s style of think Conan the Barbarian, like conjuring all those images up, right? And like that was the idea, and that sets the stage for the fun. But it broadens your experience of this game, because now you have this other input that is a little bit different, that has references that are outside of the literal game screens, and I just think it's fun. But also, I think it's a little bit of a Atari. We can kind of own that a little bit because we've kind of almost always done that, right?
Yeah.
And now that has become a little bit of an Atari thing. But I mean, like we're not the only ones. I mean, go back, look at like the first Grand Theft Auto. Like some of the artwork for those games was so iconic. not the in-game artwork. I'm talking about like the actual key art, like so iconic and so representative that almost has a little bit of a life of its own. Like slightly apart from the actual game. Like, and so I think creating great art, I think people just like to see it, and if we want to get tactical about it, it's also about branding. How can you make something that's ownable and different and stands out in the marketplace? Well, art is one of the tools at your disposal.
Yeah. And we did that. We obviously leaned into that with the Recharge series,
Yeah.
and just kind of that was the whole premise, starting with Missile Command, which was like, how do we make the Atari version of this one? And actually, then we made like that digital, that VR. No, it was augmented reality arcade cabinet to wrap in that key art. So, and then and that just set the precedent from there. And it was, I was quite pleased with a lot of those. All
Yeah.
right, let's ask the. Oh, go ahead. No,
Oh,
keep
I
going.
was just gonna say, just to put a bow on it, like it very much like does what we want, from the business side, but it also, it's a much more fun, engaging fan experience. If you receive this thing in the mail, or you buy it online, you see the Steam, imagery or whatever you see, wherever you encounter it, like it's another connection point. We're not reinventing the wheel here. Like this is movie posters. There's a reason that for most of the the era of movie posters weren't just pictures of people. They were very much like conjuring an idea about the movie and how you were going to feel, and like it's another engagement point. And I mean that's just good marketing.
Yeah, totally. Um, let's ask this last one. This is a risky one to ask, but I want to because it came up, and when you reveal that you have a journalist background, I thought, oh, let's get spicy, right? We are over the hour mark. This might be the longest podcast I've done yet, but I've been having a lot of fun. It's been pretty great. So this is like the after hours question that I'll
All
ask, and
right.
you can answer it however you want, or you could just say pass. All right, but I got to ask it. As you have a journalist background, how do you feel about the state of journalism in games media today?
It's tough. I feel both sides, right? Like, and some of my friends are either game journalists or former game journalists. I feel like it's tough because a lot of what is the journalism now is really just press releases, right? You're just regurgitating a bunch of talking points that come from, the games. I get it. But I think I almost want to step back a little further and say I think it's not even just a problem with games. I think it's a problem with like pop culture criticism as well. I think you could probably say the same thing about movie reviews. Like
Hmm.
if we go, let's use movies as an example, so that's not like in our backyard. Like let's like the Roger Eberts and the Pauline Kaels of history, who were like really critical and really like moved the idea of criticism forward. Like let's engage with ideas of the movie. Let's give people honest reviews. Let's dig into why something works or doesn't work. That's hard to do, right? And I think the way this stuff is delivered, for the most part, people now either want hot takes, or they want, just give me the PR. And it's way easier to just regurgitate the talking point. It's much harder to engage with something and dig into why it's good, why it works, why it doesn't, how it connects to all history. So like that's the most interesting thing to me. And like honestly, if you're a games journalist, like the amount of outlets that are willing to pay you a living wage to do that kind of work, they're
Hmm.
shrinking, right? And I think that's a challenge. And you see people, okay, well, I can do. What can I do? Can I do long form? Can I write a book? Can I, where I dig into those ideas more, or can I? Am I going to go somewhere else and write in some other way, in a way that like is? It's tough to find a place that wants to engage with criticism at that level versus just like, hey, can you write something that has these keywords and make sure it gets us this many clicks because traffic is how we survive. I mean, so
Hmm.
I feel for people. I think it's a tough place to be, and I'm not sure what the appetite is for like real, quote unquote serious game criticism. But I don't think I don't think there's a little bit of blame to go around for everybody.
Yeah, I don't even know if it's a matter of blame one way or the other. I think it is great response, and it got me thinking because it's an entertainment medium, right? The customers, the people driving the medium, it's entirely demand of the audience that's buying things, right? So then what is the role of those people? It's like to kind of inform me of what it is that I'm getting. And at the end of the day, if you have all people like streamers and influencers and just people posting on social media, as long as my appetite or as a consumer for that content I want is being met, and I'm learning about the things I want to learn regardless of the details, then so be it. Like, I don't know how much, like, it's great to have reporting from people like Schreier or Rebecca Valentine, like, just to name a couple, right? That are doing some more, or even like Gene Park, Washington Post, like he does some really great deep dives as well. Um, but at the end of the day, I think what kind of journalism is really going to impact the performance of something like Fortnite? you
Right.
know the people playing Fortnite just really care about Fortnite. If there was a big deep dive on how, like, oh, this is how that machine works and you won't believe that, it's like, all right, well, I'm still playing Fortnite. I don't know what the impact is. And it's the same across movies as well. I got my trailers, cool. It's like, it's amazing how fast the mindset will change just by a trailer, which can be distributed by the studios themselves on YouTube. And then, as opposed to someone who's like, well, let's go into all the stuff that's potentially going on at Marvel. You're like, oh, who cares?
Right,
Red Hulk.
exactly. Right, like journalists used to be the gatekeepers, and now they don't need to
Right.
be. Like, you can go right to your audience, so that changes the value of it. But I also think, as much as like the modern, like, of the minute, games journalism is kind of, it's a rough place to be. I think also you look at the historical work that's being done. Never, I mean, when Art of Atari came out, there were a handful of like good video game books. There weren't a ton. I mean, there's some really good ones. The Supercade by Van Burnham was a really good one. There's a
Game
couple other
over, right?
yeah. There's a couple classics, and
Yeah.
some were better than others. But you could count them on two hands probably. Like now, I mean, all sorts of books, all sorts of criticism, all sorts of history, but even just the idea that, like, part of the marketing of a big game is going to be some sort of book. It's going to be behind the scenes. And if you're somebody who's like, I'm not a programmer and I don't even play one on TV, right? But if I'm a developer or I'm interested in getting into games, like, there's a mini little video, there's like a little bit of a, almost like a mini education. Like, by reading a lot of these books, you get a sense of what it takes to make a game, and what it, what it's like, what are the different roles. That's stuff that, like, just, there wasn't the same level of transparency because of those sort of materials, and these making of books and these art books and these behind the scenes materials. And, like, that's super cool. Like, that's amazing, in the same way that sort of, streaming and YouTube has sort of opened the door for all these filmmakers who just, hey, I have an iPhone and an idea. Like, it's not that easy to make a game, of course. It's not that easy
Yeah.
to make a film, but, like, the idea that you're democratizing the tools, but you're also, like, making the creators more accessible in that way. I think it's a pretty cool time to be one of those people.
Totally. Yeah. Really, really well said. Usually, if there's time, sometimes it kind of changes a bunch of ways, but I'm gonna kind of cheat. I'm gonna ask the two closing segments at once, but a little twist on one of them. So, you sometimes like to say, what are we playing? And we'll talk about games we're playing. Instead, you just kind of open the door for, some of these deep dive journalistic books that dive into games. So, what would you recommend people check out, other than the Art of Atari, of course?
Game specific.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Well, one I would say comes to mind is Supercade Volume Two. And full disclosure, Van Burnham's a friend of mine, but she wrote it.
They
She's
don't need to
really,
know that. Nobody needs to
well,
know that.
now she,
It's
but I
completely
mean,
unbiased take. It's good content. Go check it out.
it's totally legit. I mean, I
And
wish.
follow his Amazon affiliate link in the below.
Exactly. But I mean, she was one of the pioneers of really sort of taking the sort of the art and design of games and putting them in their proper historical perspective, like, in a great looking book. And this is the second volume here, so Supercade Volume 2 is really good. I'm trying to think what else. I almost want to throw you another curveball, and give a non-game book.
Yeah, do it. Do it. Why not?
Um,
There's no rules. There are
And
no rules.
people have read this. You probably read this one. There's a book out there about the MCU, like the Marvel Cinematic Universe, and I think it's just called MCU: The Reign of Marvel Studios. And I was pretty amazed. I mean, it's like part business book, part making of book, and some of it is just like a geeky fan book. But I was really impressed at how the authors like blended all three of those things together. It was like super readable, even if you're not like a mega nerd like me. I was really impressed by it. I mean, and just I wouldn't have thought, growing up as a kid, like, oh, I'm this comic book and video game kid, like that a book about Marvel movies would be on the New York Times bestseller list. Like, nah, like I would not have envisioned that. But that's a lot of fun to read. But also, if you're a pop culture person, we work in pop culture, right? And I have for years. Um, that I feel like there's some really great nuggets of insight and just ideas in there. The place where sort of pop culture and business kind of meet. So I really like that one as well.
Awesome. All right, last question for real. What is your favorite part about being a creative director at Atari?
Oh, I mean one, the people are just really great people. I've yet to everybody's awesome at the company. But I think the other thing is when you're like a designer, like, or you're moving up the ranks. We joke about this. Like, the thing is, you put on your portfolio, you're like, oh, I did all these little projects with these little brands that no one's ever heard of. I used to do things like we did packaging for gluten-free noodles. Like, great product, really good. Like, I'm a gluten-free guy.
Gloodles.
So,
Gotta
like,
love
yeah,
them.
and it was really fun. But you're always like, oh, we did this one project for Target or Kohler or Atari, and that's like up there because you're like, oh, it's a brand everybody knows, right? My parents didn't know what I did until I said, oh yeah, I did some packaging work for Target, and they're like, what, Target? Like, you have a real job, and so like as a like a rank and file designer, you're like, oh, if you get a couple of those in your portfolio or in your work history over your course of your career, like, that's really cool. You're like, oh, I got to work on Nike, or I got to work this. Well, every day I get to work on cool things. I get to work on Atari and in television, and then there's a mental list here that's coming to my mind that I cannot
Yeah,
share yet.
yeah, yeah.
um
Redacted and
re-
redacted and oh,
exactly.
redacted's gonna be awesome.
But I mean, just the idea that we're dealing with, like, the Intellivision and these other brands that, like, would be like capstones, and I get the awesome privilege and responsibility to sort of help shepherd one of the most recognizable brands, like, in American pop culture. Like, when I tell
Yeah.
people, oh, I work at Atari, uh, you know, no one ever says what's Atari. Like, never,
No,
no one ever says what's
no.
Atari.
But
Now,
we know what they actually say though.
which is, go ahead, say it.
Oh, are they still around?
Yes. That's like that's the second question or the first question. But
Yeah. Or
everybody
what are they
knows what,
doing these days?
right, but everybody knows what Atari is, and I think that's the amazing thing, and like, that is
Yes.
a huge privilege, and it's really fun. And hey, I mean, we're not curing cancer or anything like that, but we're having a good time doing it, and I feel like we contribute to the pop culture pantheon, and it's a brand that has 50 years of really interesting, impactful history. I mean, I just it sounds like a cliche, but it's super fun to come to work every day and do that.
Yeah, truly. Now, I will say one of the best things about getting responses like that is because you have a very easy measure of success. The moment you tell somebody I work for Atari and they're like, "Oh, I love what you're doing with blank. I really liked blank." And it's something that's been done in the last, 3 or 4 years and you're like, "Yeah, it's working." And I'm very optimistic that we'll get there. And
Absolutely.
it's and you are going to be a big part of it. So thank you, and thank you for your time, Tim. If people want to find you, where can they find you? Are you on the socials?
I'm on the socials. You can find me on Twitter, or whatever we call it now, X, I guess.
X.
I'm occasionally on Instagram. Also, some of my other work is at timlapetino.com. But yeah,
What's the
most
handle? What's the Twitter handle?
Lapetino, just my last name.
Man, love it. Good stuff. You can follow me at Jays of Doom. Follow Atari. Join the Discord. Review the podcast. If you made it this far, you like it. So, or you're a huge masochist and you hate it. I don't know. But regardless, thank you for listening. And the reviews mean a lot and helps elevate us in the algorithm and reintroduce us to new people. So, Tim, once again, thanks a lot. And hey, maybe, and if you're listening, maybe we'll see you at PAX or not. Thanks for listening. Till
Awesome.
next time.
Thanks, Jason.
Bye.